Hey juniors, hope you're doing well today or tonight whenever you're choosing to watch this video. I'm going to go ahead and start today with a prayer. I know that many of you are in a situation right now where you're studying for a lot of AP exams, and so if you're feeling overwhelmed, then hopefully this prayer speaks to you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, when my heart is overwhelmed, overwhelm me with your peace. Lead me to you, my rock. Guide me to your word, which gives me strength and refuge. Help me not to run to lesser things. Draw me to run to you first. Help me get into the habit of taking my overwhelmed and placing it under your will. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. All right, I just wanted to let you know that the plan for the next few weeks is to work our way through The Great Gatsby. If you've been kind of keeping up with things on Power School, you know that I'm asking you to read about 3 chapters a week, which is a little bit of a heavy load, but because I acknowledge that you are reading a bit more than usual, I'm going to cut back pretty drastically on any kind of writing assignments. I really want your focus in the next few weeks to be on making sure you're prepared for the AP exam, and I do acknowledge that you have other AP exams that you're working to prepare for as well. So basically, I'm going to try to do the lion's share of the work for you in terms of just kind of helping you understand what's important in each chapter. And then if I do ask you to complete anything on a daily basis, it's likely just going to be a small exit ticket. And that's really just to make sure that you're being accountable and you're still doing work on the assigned class days. So my pledge is to try to keep these chapters, my explanation of these chapters, as short as I can. I tend to be a little bit verbose, and I'm so passionate about this novel that it's hard not to talk about it. But I'll do what I can to try to keep things succinct for you. So if you're looking at my screen right now, you likely realize that there is a map, a Google map of New York City. I briefly want to talk to you about the setting because it's my opinion, at least, that the setting really functions almost as a character in and of itself in this text. So we have to understand kind of where things are situated and why these different places that they go to matter in the novel. So I want to start by, if you look at my cursor, hopefully it's in the video for you. I'm going to start by talking about Manhattan. So if you notice, Manhattan is, I don't know if you knew this or not, but it's actually an island. It's 13.1 miles long. And, you know, I could zoom in here and you would probably start to recognize some familiar landmarks, you know, like you can see Yankee Stadium, Washington Heights. I don't know if any of you are Lin-Manuel Miranda fans, but before he made Hamilton, he made In the Heights, which is based on this neighborhood here. And then we have, like, over here's the Upper West Side. Then you've got the Upper East Side over here. You got your Central Park, the Guggenheim. Down here's the Met, Rockefeller, Empire State Building, and then if I kept going down, you'd see the Brooklyn Bridge, Brooklyn, and then over to the east here, you'd see Queens. Why am I going into all this? Well, you're going to find out that at various points in the novel, they do end up in these different locations. I want you to kind of keep in mind that Manhattan then and Manhattan now sort of represents the pinnacle of the American dream. I have a friend who lives on the Upper East Side, and it takes a lot to be able to live there financially and just in terms of your sort of tirelessness, how hard you're willing to work. And so I think in many respects, we want to kind of keep in mind that, you know, it's just like Frank Sinatra's song, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, right? It's very challenging. I think it's a young person's city, not for old people to live there, because it's just, you know, always go, go, go. It's an electric city. But as we make our way out a little bit, I'm going to zoom out for just a moment so you can kind of see this. You know, you've got down kind of southeast of Manhattan, you've got Brooklyn, you've got Queens, and then all of this is Long Island and the Hamptons. You can see Long Island Sound here. So if I zoom back in chapter 2, you learn at the opening of the chapter that there's a place called the Valley of Ashes. And what I want you to keep in mind is that all of these places in the novel are based on actual places. So we got to keep in mind that, 100 years ago when this was written, Queens was sort of the dumping ground, the kind of industrial wasteland, because anytime you're moving from an agricultural to an industrial base, you're going to have refuse, you're going to have pollution, you're going to have those side effects. And so where Queens is, here's the Valley of Ashes. And you'll notice that whenever the Buchanans or Gatsby or Nick, when they take their trips into Manhattan, they've got to pass through the Valley of Ashes. And so it's this idea that you can't remain unadulterated or untainted. You are getting filthy in the process of crossing that landscape. All right. So as we like this, okay, so Valley of Ashes is actually down here. Unfortunately, the drawing tools kind of stay where they are. But over here, you've got this sort of set of protrusions, and this over here is East Egg, and over here is West Egg. Now, they're not actually called that. Fitzgerald fictionalized that, but he did base these locations on places that he knew. And so what I guess I want you to be aware of as we make our way through the novel is the idea that even though geographically these two places look the same, they're dramatically different in terms of both the architecture that you tend to find on it and also the people that inhabit those spaces. So over here on East Egg, you've got people who've inherited wealth and they've always had it, right? It's been passed down generation to generation. These are people that are refined. They have good breeding. They're sort of the aristocracy. I would just call them the old rich, right? It's like they've always had money, and that's where your Buchanans reside. Okay, over here on West Egg, you've got Jay Gatsby, and you've got Nick Carraway. And the other thing that I would add to this is just that West Egg tends to be comprised of people who are nouveau riche or new money. They're people who have, the turn of the century brought about a lot of opportunities. And as you'll find in chapter 3, when Fitzgerald lists all the names of the people that live there, you're going to find a bevy of Broadway stars and people who managed to get rich through the Prohibition or through any other kinds of means. Usually things kind of involving technology or modern advances. So what you need to keep in mind, what may not be obvious or explicitly clear at first, is this notion that both of these communities are very wealthy, but West Egg is new money, East Egg is old money. And because of that, I think you'll find that the East Eggers, I don't know that I want to say they feel threatened, but they feel that they are of a different class. And they kind of they feel a condescending sort of attitude toward the West Egg people, in that they think that these people still aren't quite fit to operate in their circles. And so you're really going to see that conveyed. I think Jay Gatsby is naive and hopeful and romantic in that he believes that if he now has accumulated money, he's going to be accepted far and wide by everyone. But again, that's a really ignorant, I shouldn't say ignorant, but it's a naive attitude. He thinks that money will change things. All right, so as we get into the first chapter, I'm going to pull up the text for you here just in case I reference any lines. I don't know that I'm going to use the drawing tools a whole lot because I basically have to erase then what I write. It doesn't move out of the way for me. So a couple of things to keep in mind as we start reading is that, first of all, If you recall my presentation on modernism, we know that the modernists had a tendency to experiment with narration, and you're going to find that sometimes you'll find unreliable narrators. I'm not here to tell you that Nick is unreliable. I'm just telling you that when you approach any kind of narrator in a modernist work, you have to call into question the extent to which you can trust that character or that narration, because these are people that are going to tend to have some blind spots or limitations in their ability to see clearly. So we know our narrator is named Nick Carraway. You won't find out until much later in the novel, I think chapter 6 or chapter 7. And I don't like to give away too much, but I will tell you, just to kind of orient you, that he is close to 30 years old. I suppose there are some details in the text here. He tells us that he graduated from New Haven in 1915. And then we also learn that he goes to fight in World War I, but we don't get clear details about how long he's there. So you know that, I mean, you can kind of pinpoint his age within a certain range, but just letting you know that he's close to 30 years old. And for me, I mean, I have that reference point. I made the decision to move to Hawaii right as I was turning 30. And it's kind of a weird age because you still feel young, but you can kind of feel that youth fleeting. You're not in your 20s anymore. And so I think, and I'm only speaking from my own perspective, but I see it reflected in Nick, that there's a sort of wistfulness. There's this idea that, like, hey, I'm not old yet, but also, ooh, I'm beginning to see my youth in the rearview mirror and what comes with that feeling, you know? So a couple of things about Nick. Here we find out that his father gave him some advice. That advice was that he said, remember, son, not everyone has had the advantages that you've had. So that communicates to us that he's got a certain degree of privilege. He's certainly not as wealthy as the Buchanans, but I would position him as solidly middle class, or maybe even on the low end of upper middle class. And I think because of those advantages here, Nick tells us that he tries to incline himself to reserve judgments. Now, what I'm going to put you to think about as we make our way through this text is whether or not that's actually true. You know, he says, well, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, but then I want to pose that question to you, well, does he? So kind of pay attention to that as we make our way through the text. All right, I'm going to have to erase this because I'm going to keep moving on. I just want you to collect some information about Nick, namely a couple of these things. He mentions in this segment here of the text that he has a tendency to be more reserved in nature, and because of it, there's some kind of quality that he has that makes people want to open up to him and spill their secrets to him, even when he's bored with them. So he gives off this impression that he's interested and that he can keep a secret, and that makes people feel like they can trust him. All right, we get some important details here, and I want you to think about this in terms of the narration. Right about here, he tells us that he came back from the East last autumn. So that signals to us right now that he's at a moment in time and he's looking back on something that happened to him in the previous year. And so he's also communicating that he's no longer in that same geographic space, okay? In one respect, this is a novel that sets up a dichotomy, the East versus the West. And by West, I really mean the Middle West because he's from Minnesota. But Fitzgerald is setting up this contrast between those two places and all that they represent. And what Nick tells us here is he said, I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. So that tells us that he got too close. He had these glimpses into the human heart, and he didn't like what he saw because they appeared to be riotous excursions. So what we're told here is that he undergoes, I guess, a set of experiences that leaves him feeling sort of disgusted, appalled, repulsed by what he witnessed. So much so that he feels the need to leave the East and go back to the Midwest, which for him represents integrity, represents hard work, represents honesty, um, honest living, that kind of thing. I feel like I'm being redundant. So you got to keep in mind that these people he met out east, I mean, he kind of like went scorched earth on them. He left. He's not in communication with them anymore. But he does tell us that he reserved judgment on Gatsby. So he kind of sets Gatsby apart. And it's important to keep in mind because it becomes really clear right here that he's not objective when it comes to Gatsby. He's like number one fan, even though Gatsby represents all of the things that he hated about being out east. So what is it that he likes so much about Gatsby? He says that if personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. And he talks about Gatsby's heightened sensitivity to the promises of life. And I think a little bit later, he says right here, there's a romantic readiness to him. So I think that even though Gatsby is operating in that world that is sort of morally bereft, Gatsby still had a kind of innocence and a kind of naivete that Nick found to be refreshing and endearing, and that made him really still look back on what happened and think about Gatsby fondly. And he says here, Gatsby turned all right in the end. He turned out all right in the end. It was what preyed on him. So he positions Gatsby here as like somebody that got hurt in the collateral damage of this whole series of events that unfolded. All right, as we collect more information about Nick, I want you to, keep a log, keep track of this information. How did his family get their money? We're told right here at the bottom or the top of page 5, I guess it is, that his great uncle started a wholesale hardware business and that they've had the money in their family for 3 generations. I could go into more detail about this whole piece of information where his great uncle sent someone else to fight in Civil War for him, because I think it does connect back to Nick's character, but I want to keep things moving, and if I can, I'll get back there at some point. All right, we have a rhetorical tool at play here. Nick tells us, I graduated from New Haven in 1915. So we've got metonymy. I'm just trying to throw out some words that'll help you review for the exam. And metonymy, if you recall, I don't know if you remember this or not, but basically it's a figure of speech where you use something that's closely related to something else to stand in place for that thing. Really common metonymy that you might hear about if you listen to the news at night is if they say the White House is reporting that. Well, it's not literal because, of course, the White House is just an inanimate object. It's a building. But usually what that means is whoever's holding the office of the president and or the president's administration. So it's something closely related. You might hear that too in the UK if they're talking about the crown to represent Queen Elizabeth II. So here where it says, I graduated from New Haven, we all know, if we pay a lot of attention to colleges, that there's a really famous university in New Haven, Connecticut, and that would be Yale. So by him saying New Haven, he's not explicitly telling us that he went to Yale, but we can make that inference, and it's, metonymy. All right. A little bit after that, Nick tells us that he participated in the Great War. So we find out that he's a World War veteran. He just kind of shoves that under the rug. He doesn't really go into detail about all that entailed. But when he does return from the war, and I would imagine he's kind of hyped up on adrenaline from the war, he does say here that the Middle West started to feel really sluggish, slow, small to him. He says it felt like it was the ragged edge of the universe. And so he wanted to go east and learn the bond business. So this is really like his opportunity to begin a career, and he thinks he wants to go into bonds, which makes sense, right? It's right before the Great Depression, and so it's a big booming business. But bonds are a little bit more risk averse than stocks. So it's a little bit conservative, a little bit safer than going into stocks. Daddy agrees to finance him for a year. Sorry, I don't mean to sound sardonic there or anything, but he does say that his father is paying for this. So it's basically like an opportunity for him to get on his feet and kind of begin that adult life. I don't want to say he wasn't an adult because he went to World War I, but this is the beginning, I guess, of what he's hoping will be a career. Just to give us a little information here about the setting, we find out it's the spring of 22. So I always think it's important to know what year something's taking place if that information is given. And then, of course, if they're going to mention seasons, that can be symbolic. And I think it's no accident here in Fitzgerald because you're going to see lots of references to that. And, of course, when we think about spring metaphorically, that's when new life, comes up. There's rebirth, new opportunities. So it makes sense that he's beginning a sort of new life in New York as a bondsman. All right, so he's got to find a place to live. We find out that he's renting, as he calls it, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, which makes it sound like a shack compared to where the Buchanans and Gatsby live. But I think of it as like a cozy, quaint little cottage. So keep in mind that Nick is on West Egg. I've told you that. Thematically, I think there's some work you could do here where Nick says that when he went out there, he felt like a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. I do think he's trying to come to some sort of discovery about who he is and what he believes, and we're going to see that kind of unfold in this text. All right, so let's kind of look at, I'm going to kind of skip past where he's talking about reading and getting ready for his job. I think it's important to pay attention here to Fitzgerald's description of the two eggs, because it does tell us that it's in the Long Island Sound, which I showed to you in the map. And it talks about how to the birds, these two land masses might look very similar, but they're dissimilar in every other respect to humans. All right, so just to kind of key you in, I had talked about the difference between the two, but here Nick tells us West Egg is less fashionable. He gives us some important information here in saying that Gatsby, the one on my right, his house was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville, which is French. And sorry, that's the wrong one. I found an image for you. I know it's probably small on your screen, but you can see it here. You can see how ostentatious, over the top, lavish, even garish the display of wealth is in this particular property. Okay, so if you imagine a little bungalow next to that monstrosity, you can understand just how different these two are in terms of their wealth. All right, at the top of page 8 here, it mentions fashionable East Egg, and this is where our story really begins, or the flashback begins. So Nick's going to have dinner with the Buchanans, and we get a description of their house. It may not be on this page, but we're told that it's a red and white Georgian colonial mansion, and you can see that obviously anyone residing in a house such as that has a lot of money, but it's a little bit more elegant and I would say understated than what you saw with Gatsby's mansion. And so Nick goes to join them for dinner. He's been invited. And what you need to keep in mind is that he's accepted by both of them. I think by Daisy because they are distant relatives, and by Tom because they both attended college together. All right, one of my favorite passages in chapter 1 concerns the way that Fitzgerald characterizes Tom. So I just love this line here. He mentions that Tom was a powerful end. This is where I'd look to Sam or Ryan to help communicate to us what an end's job is, because I'm not a football expert. But he was one of the most powerful ends ever to play at Yale, and he was nationally known. But I love this line here. He's one of these men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. So you have to imagine that this guy is used to being at the top of the food chain. And after 21, everything is going to go downhill. And you can imagine that this guy, given his privilege, given his wealth, is not going to deal with that well. And it mentions here that he was so wealthy that his family could just bring a string of polo ponies wherever they want to go. So his wealth is astounding. But there's an even better passage to describe Tom coming up, where I really want you to look at how Fitzgerald uses words. Now, Fitzgerald also does plant some Easter eggs. Just really quickly, we get one here. Okay, Nick tells us why they came east. I don't know. They spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then they drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. I love that because it does show us, I don't want to say that Nick is resentful, but you can see that he does feel a little bit like he's on the margins. He's definitely on the outside of this. But you have to be asking yourself, well, why do they drift around? Why do they move from place to place if it's not required? We don't get any indication that it has to do with the type of job Tom has. So I would kind of ask you to think about that. There's an underlying reason why they're moving around. But Daisy says it's going to be permanent, and Nick tells us here, I didn't believe that. And he says, I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. Love that line too. All right, so moving on, here's where we get the description of the Buchanan's house. And this is the set of lines that I love, because you can really look at how Fitzgerald uses diction to position us and our loyalties. So in describing Tom, we're told that he's sturdy. We're told that he's supercilious, and that word means that you're disdainfully haughty. So you think you are better than other people. We're told that he's arrogant. We're told that his eyes establish dominance. This notion that he's always leaning aggressively forward. And we're told that even, like riding clothes on a man, like horseback riding clothes, could make a man look effeminate or more feminine. But it says that not even the effeminate nature of those clothes could conceal the enormous power of that body. And you get this idea here of straining, pack of muscles. And then it says it was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. Okay. And as the next paragraph begins, you can see that it's mentioned that he has a tenor voice with fractiousness in it. If you're fractious, you like to start arguments. You're quarrelsome. So when you look at this collection of words, you can see that this guy's a jerk. Like, Fitzgerald does not want you to like him. And as we make our way through sort of the rest of this chapter, or even just the next kind of few pages, you're going to see that when Tom approaches Nick, he's like steering him around, like grabbing his arm, pulling him through the house. All right, and we also find out that he has paternal contempt, so he kind of comes across as like a colonizer. Here's where we get some of that turning me around by one arm. He turned me around again. So this guy is used to being in control, and he doesn't like it when he feels like he's losing any kind of grip on that control. As we look at this paragraph here, there's some really great movement being conveyed as the wind is billowing in and moving the curtains around. But once Tom comes in, you'll notice it talks about like how the ladies' dresses were rippling and fluttering. But eventually it gets to the point where there was a boom where Tom shut the rear windows. And so I want you to think of him as someone who has the capacity to harm or maim people, and as someone who is who just has a lot of leverage and the capacity to be cruel. All right, we get the inclusion of a new character here in this paragraph. We learn about Jordan Baker. And hopefully you've picked up on the idea that in the first chapter, she is a golfer. She's described in a really interesting way because she's not conventionally feminine. It talks about how a lot of times when we see her, she's holding her chin up like she's balancing something on it. She, at one point, is compared to a cadet. I forget where it is, but we see that. And so I want you to keep in mind she's kind of androgynous, and I would say she's representative of that flapper figure from the 1920s. So she's unconventional in that she is not married. She lives with her aunt, I believe, and so there's no kind of father or husband or brother controlling her every move. And she's a golfer. So she really is like that modern woman. All right, something I want you to keep in mind about Daisy is that every time Nick describes her, or not every time, but often when he describes her, I'm going to use green on purpose, it mentions that Daisy has a low, thrilling voice. And this is a really famous line. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it. So it just says that there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget, a singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since. So if you know your classical mythology, particularly Homer and the Odyssey, you know about the reference to the sirens. And I would kind of argue right here that in describing Daisy's voice so extensively and talking about that as the kind of characteristic that distinguishes her, I think Fitzgerald wants you to see her as someone who is alluring. But if you think about what the sirens did, they lured men to their deaths. And so there is a danger in getting involved with someone like Daisy. We'll find out why that is. All right, so moving on. Tom and Daisy have a baby. They call it the baby. We learn at one point that her name's Pam, but she's 3 years old. And you can see very clearly that they are detached from their child. I mean, it's almost like the kid's a little thing they trot around and then put away. You really don't see the kid at all. So I think that tells you something about their priorities and their values. Here's where we get a little intimation or clue that Jordan Baker is in training. That tells us that she's a golfer. We'll find out. Here, Nick tells us, I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. So that's why I say she's androgynous. You know, I imagine she's almost always depicted in film adaptations as having a dark hair, although it's described as being like the color of an autumn leaf, so kind of maybe more auburn. But she looks like a cadet. And a cadet's, you know, a male soldier. Well, historically, at that time, certainly a male soldier. And her gray, sun-strained eyes look back at me with a charming, discontented face. So this is again, I think Fitzgerald's communicating this modern woman, this flapper girl. But he's also setting us up for a potential romance between Nick and Jordan. We get the first mention here of Gatsby, but it's kind of shrouded in mystery. Jordan mentions that she knows someone on West Egg and that it's Gatsby, but we don't learn much about him. So Nick might be curious here, but he doesn't get any info. Then they move to dinner, and really the main thing to kind of take away from dinner here is that, try and get rid of some of this a little bit. Main thing about dinner is that the telephone rings in the middle of dinner. And at one point in this chapter, you may notice that the telephone is described as the fifth guest. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind, that as a modernist work, it is calling into question the place of technology. Certainly, it can bring communication to you and make things easier. But here it kind of functions as a source of intrusion because it's the way that Tom's mistress is trying to contact him. And she knows better. She knows he's married. She knows it's dinner time and that he's with his wife. And I think she's just doing this to drive a wedge in things. All right. So bottom line, too, is that we find out in this chapter through some pretty subtle clues that Daisy is aware that it's going on, but she is feigning ignorance and pretending like she doesn't know anything. And I think that's because in her social environment, that's the expectation. You don't make a fuss. You don't do anything that would bring shame or embarrassment to your family. And so even if Tom is behaving in a way that's shameful, Daisy isn't going to make it obvious or known to anyone else. Now, in this segment here, it bears mentioning at the top of page 16 here, Tom mentions this book, The Rise of the Colored Empires, and he says the idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. So what that communicates to us is that Tom is a white supremacist. I mean, he may not be putting on a Ku Klux Klan hood, but he has this notion that white people should be at the top of the pecking order. And you can see here that he feels threatened by the prospect that people like him, that is to say WASP types, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, may be losing a foothold on their dominance and privilege. So that's something to kind of note or keep in mind about Tom. Okay, interesting information about Jordan. Here's where the phone had rung and they both went in, and Jordan wants to eavesdrop, so she tells Nick to stop making conversation with her because she wants to hear what's going on inside. And that's when she communicates to Nick, because he is not in the know, but apparently everyone else is. This is where it says Tom's got some woman in New York. So we go back to that whole information about why they left or why they moved around. Maybe these things are a little connected. All right. You can see that when Daisy comes back, she has tense gaiety. So that's that idea that she's tense, like that's her real emotion, but she's trying to cover it up with that jollity and that gaiety. All right, we get some really important lines here. We find out here on page 20 that when Daisy did have her child, she says Tom was God knows where when she was less than an hour old. So this is their first child, and Tom abandons her, or he's not there at her side when she's giving birth. I think that communicates quite a bit about his investment in this relationship. And Daisy says, I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. And then she finds out that her daughter's a girl, and she says, well, I'm glad it's a girl. I hope that she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. So I think because of her class, there's sort of an expectation that it doesn't serve you well to be a smart woman, because you realize kind of the fault lines in the upper crust of society, the things that aren't working. And so we can see that Daisy, in much of this, she's actually a lot smarter than she pretends to be. She's not stupid, but she puts on this kind of insincere public performance where she plays that role of a beautiful little fool. Okay, we find out here that Jordan's playing in the tournament tomorrow over at Westchester, so that's more information kind of communicating that she's a golfer. Westchester is north of New York City. It's a pretty well-to-do suburb. A lot of people who want proximity to the city but don't want to live in the city move out there. We can see here that Daisy is kind of thinking about throwing together Nick and Jordan. They seem like they could be a possible match. We do also find out that Nick had been engaged before, but this is where no matter how many times I read this text, it's blurry. And that's, again, because of Nick as a narrator. He's trying to tamp down things that he doesn't really want to talk to us about. And so what's he got to hide? What happened with that relationship? Why didn't he follow through with it? Why is he out here on his own? Why didn't that engagement hold? We got to ask ourselves those questions, because I think it reveals something about him. All right, we also find out that both Daisy and Jordan are friends because they knew each other when they were young. They were from Louisville, Kentucky. One of my friends from Honolulu who taught with me used to teach AP language long ago, and she actually was an AP language reader for years. And for a long time, they met in Louisville, Kentucky. That's where all of the AP Lang readers convened to read all of your exams. And they actually would go to the Seelbach Hotel, which is mentioned a little later in this novel. So just a little, piece of info for you. It's a real place and you can visit it. All right, as we try to kind of close the door on this chapter, I mentioned this whole thing about his engagement and how he presents it in this kind of cloudy, nebulous way and doesn't really give us straight facts. And then we can see kind of Nick's contempt, maybe a strong word, but his disapproval of Tom having the mistress, and also this, he doesn't like what Tom is saying about this rise of the colored empires. All right, so Nick heads back to West Egg as it's the end of the evening. And really what you need to pay attention to is at the end of this chapter, he gets this image and he deduces that it's Mr. Gatsby. But what you kind of got to keep in mind here is he's standing with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. So it almost looks like something out of a dream, I think, because of that silver pepper of the stars. And he was about to call out to Gatsby, trying to introduce himself, but then it says, I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation, and that word just means like a hint or a suggestion, that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been at the end of a dock. When I looked once more, Gatsby had disappeared. So that is a really important thing. This single green light is symbolic. You'll find out what it represents, but it's no accident that Fitzgerald ends this chapter with Gatsby, his hands stretched out toward that green light, trembling, because, man, that represents something major. Okay, that's it for this chapter.